25 years ago, when I was starting out in ministry, I worked with a minister who was 65. And on one of my first days, he said, my job as the young guy was to push him so that he didn't coast when he retired. And his job was to make sure that the young wild buck didn't do too many crazy things. And there was some sense of wisdom to that. There was a sense in which continuity from what he was doing to what I was doing was true. Fast forward 10 years when I got ordained, and the minister I was working with then, not near retirement age, but still older and more senior than I, said this to me when I got ordained. You are not going to get to retire in the same church as you are ordained into. There's a sense there that there's discontinuity, and however we want to play it and however we want to think about it, I think that second minister is right. There's more discontinuity between what's gone before than what's going afterwards. We're not going to get to retire into the same church that we were ordained into, because it's now a secular age. This week we're moving from part 1 to part 2 of The Pastor in a Secular Age, from what shaped us to what the shape of things to come is. And it's a good opportunity in that transition time to be able to think about our own pastoral identity in terms of what shaped us and how we want to be in the future. I know without a doubt that the most formative influence on my pastoral identity was Hans Cowenberg, and he died last week. And so I've had a lot of opportunity to think about what that means for me and for my life. Hans was likely the best pastor I ever knew, and I succeeded him at Calvin Presbyterian Church with a lot of trepidation. There's a lot that I could say, and I won't on this video because I want to keep it to a reasonable time, but also because there are things that I haven't quite sorted out yet. But there are 3 things that I can talk about. The first is the fact that I do think that there is a change that's going on in what we understand as the pastor. The second is that our understanding of what pastoral care is and how that shapes us as people is changing. And the third is that the way that we preach and the way that we proclaim the gospel is going to be different from the past to the future. You may know the story of St. Francis, and he is walking by a decrepit church and he hears the voice of God, it turns out, saying, "Build my church." And so St. Francis goes to the local quarry and buys rocks and comes back and starts building the church. But in reality, what his responsibility was to build up the church, the body of the church. And there's always been this conflict, potentially, in the church between the body and the institution, between the people and the buildings and the structures that hold those people. This isn't the place to have a debate about those two, but one of the things that, at least for me in my relationship with the Hans, was that Hans was very much a build the people kind of person. I, on the other hand, came and built a building at Calvin Presbyterian, and maybe sacrificed some of the people and my relationships with them in doing so. I do want to be clear that I think that I was a pastor in doing that I had the long-term vision for God's people and their health in view, and certainly didn't do it by stomping on people and their will. It was their choice. This is what they wanted. But the thing that strikes me, at least in relationship to this idea of pastoral identity in the secular age, is I'm not sure that there is a one-size-fits-all kind of pastor. Hans was what I would call a great farmer pastor, meaning he tended his sheep, he looked after his flock in one place, he really sacrificed for them. I was likely a building pastor, somebody who made sure that the field was safe and around, that there were barns for things to go into. All of this is necessary for the ongoing life of the church. So the idea that we could find one pastoral identity is put to lie by having two pastors in the same place. One of the things I had to get used to when I went to Calvin was that elders expected me to be present in people's lives all the time. They expected if I heard that somebody was sick that I would be there, that if I heard that they were having problems, I would be there, that if they had something to celebrate, I would be there, if they had guests, I would be there. And finally it dawned on me why they had this expectation. It's because Hans was there. Hans had tiny little handwriting, and he kept meticulous notes about everybody that he knew and possibly would visit. And at the drop of a hat, he would be off. He organized a chaplaincy program for the hospital because he couldn't be there enough. I think that there's a difference between Hans and I in this. And it's not a value judgment. He was a great pastor. He believed that it was his role to be in people's lives, in the granular, in the nitty-gritty, everything in their lives part. I, on the other hand, have a much harder time being open to interfering in somebody else's life. I wait for the invitation, where Hans assumed that there was an invitation by the pastor. I wonder if in days past that was the expectation, but in days future that the shape of things to come is going to be different. Both Hans and I love the Bible, and we would both like to think that we're biblical preachers, but there are differences. Hans had all of his manuscripts written out. No word was wasted. He had literary references. One of his idols was C.S. Lewis, and there was littered throughout his sermons. I, on the other hand, tend to be too academic, and so I try to not use a script, but have ideas. And I have experimented with more narrative styles of preaching. One time I preached using an image from the TV show The Walking Dead. And it wasn't even involving zombies, but there was an apocalypse going on, and then there was this moment of life, and I was trying to get people during Advent to realize the cataclysmic but also the apocalyptic nature of God's intervention in the world. Well, I heard about it for weeks after that, on both sides. On some sides they were yelling at me that how could I possibly talk about zombies in the pulpit? And on the other side they were amazed that this was exactly the kind of story that they resonated with. These two different ways of preaching, I think, reflect a different understanding. I wanted to try to draw people into an experience of the gospel, and Hans wanted to faithfully proclaim and give them something. This video's Ask Andy has to do with the question of masks and identity. One of us in our group was wondering about the role that they play in their congregation and even in their family, and how that might affect their sense of a buffered self or not. Here are some of Andy's thoughts.
About the difference between the buffered self and masks. I think that the point about masks is a really good one, and the way it impacts a pastor needing to kind of feel like you need to wear a mask at times. Let me put it this way. I think the age of authenticity is very hard for being a pastor, because what happens in authenticity is living in and bearing the office becomes in some sense inauthentic. And now there's some good reasons for that. Some people hid behind the office. Some people use the office to be oppressive. Some people use the office to be very different than kind of emotionally or even spiritually available. You just kind of wielded the office. But the downside to this is that when authenticity becomes such a high good, it can become overwhelming. And there is a kind of psychological necessity to take on a certain form of action and a kind of certain, call it a mask, I guess. That not all masks are bad. You even think of masked balls there was something good about them. It got away from, in kind of an aristocratian society, got away from looks and the need for looking at just nobility or whatever. I mean, they were all nobles, but you know what I mean, of just judging one another by that way and just meeting each other. So masks can serve a good purpose, but it becomes a real hard thing in the age of authenticity, because you're told you're the most authentic if you throw off all your masks and you're always just loudly yourself in every environment. Though being a human being, whatever social environment you're in does impose upon you. It does kind of frame who you are, and you could call that a mask, or you could call that just responsive to the community, or inside the pastoral ministry, you have to kind of bear the weight of the office in some ways, even though now it's so confused because people don't really want you to, and you have to just be your authentic self, but yet what they really want is a pastor, and the pastor has to bear the office. So it's difficult. What I would want to say, just more theoretically and intellectually, is that there's a connection here. I would want to say masks, the conversation on masks is more of a psychological conversation, more of a kind of a lived psychological conversation, and that's really helpful and really important. And it does connect with the age of authenticity in a big way, as the question kind of lays out. When Taylor's talking about porous selves and buffered selves, there's some similarity, but really what he's talking about here is at a more macro level, the way we think about the essence of our being, the way we think that things can encounter or can't encounter the essence of our very being. Like, what could actually mess with your essence? And for people before modernity, there was a sense that there were non-material forces that could get inside of your being and impact your being. So if you were depressed, it wasn't just the chemical constitution of your organic biological brain. It was the essence of your being was dealing with the darkness of the devil or the darkness of hell or whatever. The buffer means that there is a buffer, there's a barrier between even what we feel in our bodies and the essence of who we are, that we don't necessarily think non-material moods or even non-material spirits can get into the essence of our being as much as we once did.
My goal in this video was to show you some of the struggles and questions that I've been wrestling with as I finished part one and the bridge in Andy's Pastor as a Secular Age. Questions around my own pastoral identity and how it's been formed, in particular in relationship to hands. But it's all in the service, hopefully, of being able to open us up to what's coming in part two, which is a theological exploration of who we might become. It's my hope that as you struggle and work with this material, that God will continue to shape you and move you and to be able to form you into a pastor for the secular age.